On our way home from Mass, we would often meet Monsieur Legrandin, who, detained in Paris by his professional duties as an engineer, could only, except in the regular holiday seasons, visit his home at Combray between Saturday evenings and Monday mornings. He was one of that class of men who, apart from a scientific career in which they may well have proved brilliantly successful, have acquired an entirely different kind of culture, literary or artistic, of which they make no use in the specialized work of their profession, but by which their conversation profits. More quote-unquote literary than many quote-unquote men of letters, we were not aware at this period that Monsieur Legrandin had a distinct reputation as a writer, and so were greatly astonished to find that a well-known composer had set some verses of his to music. Endowed with a greater ease and execution than many painters, they imagine that the life they are obliged to lead is not that for which they are really fitted, and they bring to their regular occupations either a fantastic indifference or a sustained and lofty application, scornful, bitter, and conscientious. Tall, with a good figure, a fine, thoughtful face, drooping fair mustaches, a look of disillusionment in his blue eyes, an almost exaggerated refinement of courtesy, a talker such as we had never heard, he was in the sight of my family, who never ceased to quote him as an example, the very pattern of a gentleman, who took life in the noblest and most delicate manner. My grandmother alone found fault with him for speaking a little too well, a little too much like a book, for not using a vocabulary as natural as his loosely knotted Lavalier neckties, his short, straight, almost schoolboyish coat. She was astonished, too, at the furious invective which he was always launching at the aristocracy, at fashionable life and snobbishness. Undoubtedly, he would say, the sin of which St. Paul is thinking when he speaks of the sin for which there is no forgiveness. Worldly ambition was a thing which my grandmother was so little capable of feeling, or indeed of understanding, that it seemed to her futile to apply so much heat to its condemnation. Besides, she thought it not very good taste that Monsieur Legrandin, whose sister was married to a country gentleman of Lower Normandy near Balbec, should deliver himself of such violent attacks upon the nobles, going so far as to blame the Revolution for not having guillotined them all. "Well met, my friends," he would say as he came towards us. "You are lucky to spend so much time here. Tomorrow I have to go back to Paris, to squeeze back into my niche. Oh, I admit," he went on with his own peculiar smile, gently ironical, disillusioned and vague, "I have every useless thing in the world in my house there. The only thing wanting is the necessary thing, a great patch of open sky like this. Always try to keep a patch of sky above your life, little boy," he added, turning to me. "You have a soul in you of rare quality, an artist's nature. Never let it starve for lack of what it needs." When, on our reaching the house, my aunt would send us to ask whether Madame Goupil had indeed arrived late for Mass, not one of us could inform her. Instead, we increased her anxiety by telling her that there was a painter at work in the church, copying the window of Gilbert the Bad. Françoise was at once dispatched to the grocer's, but returned empty-handed, owing to the absence of Theodore, whose dual profession of choirman, with a part in the maintenance of the fabric, and of grocer's assistant, gave him not only relations with all sections of society, but an encyclopedic knowledge of their affairs. "Ah," my aunt would sigh, "I wish it were time for Eulalie to come. She is really the only person who will be able to tell me." Eulalie was a limping, energetic, deaf spinster who had quote-unquote retired after the death of Madame de la Bretonnerie, with whom she had been in service from her childhood, and had then taken a room beside the church, from which she would incessantly emerge, either to attend some service, or when there was no service, to say a prayer for herself, or give to Theodore a hand. The rest of her time she spent in visiting sick persons like my Aunt Leonie, to whom she would relate everything that had occurred at Mass or Vespers. She was not above adding occasional pocket money to the little income which was found for her by the family of her old employers, by going from time to time to look after the curé's linen, or that of some other person of note in the clerical world of Combray. Above a mantle of black cloth, she wore a little white coif that seemed almost to attach her to some order, and an infirmity of the skin had stained part of her cheeks, and her crooked nose the bright red color of balsam. Her visits were one of the great distractions in the life of my Aunt Leonie, who now saw hardly anyone else except the Reverend Curé. My aunt had by degrees erased every other visitor's name from her list, because they all committed the fatal error, in her eyes, of falling into one or other of the two categories of people she most detested. One group, the worst of the two, and the one of which she rid herself first, consisted of those who advised her not to take so much care of herself, and preached, if only negatively and with no outward signs beyond an occasional disapproving silence or doubting smile, the subversive doctrine that a sharp walk in the sun and a good red beefsteak would do her more good. Her, who had had 2 dreadful sips of Vichy water on her stomach for 14 hours, then all her medicine bottles and her bed. The other category was composed of people who appeared to believe that she was more seriously ill than she thought, in fact, that she was as seriously ill as she said. And so none of those whom she had allowed upstairs to her room after considerable hesitation and at Francois's urgent request, and who in the course of their visit had shown how unworthy they were of the honor which had been done them by venturing a timid, "Don't you think that if you were just to stir out a little on a really fine days," or who, on the other hand, when she said to them, "I am very low, nearing the end, dear friends," had replied, "Ah, yes, when one has no strength left. Still, you may last a while yet." Each party alike might be certain that her doors would never open to them again. And if Françoise was amused by the look of consternation on my aunt's face when she saw from her bed any of the people of the Rue de Saint-Esprit who looked as if they were coming to see her, or heard her own doorbell ring, she would laugh far more heartily, as at a clever trick, at my aunt's devices, which never failed for her having sent them away, and at their look of discomfiture when they had to turn back without having seen her, and would be filled with secret admiration for her mistress, whom she felt to be superior to all these other people, inasmuch as she could and did contrive not to see them. In short, my aunt stipulated at one and at the same time that whoever came to see her must approve of her way of life, commiserate with her in her sufferings, and assure her of an ultimate recovery. In all this Eulalie excelled. My aunt might say to her 20 times in a minute, "The end is come at last, my poor Eulalie." 20 times Eulalie would retort with, "Knowing your illness as you do, Madame Octave, you will live to be 100, as Madame Sazarin said to me only yesterday." For one of Eulalie's most rooted beliefs, and one that the formidable list of corrections which her experience must have compiled was powerless to eradicate, was that Madame Sazaret's name was really Madame Sazarin. "I do not ask to live to 100, my aunt would say, for she preferred not to have definite limit fixed to her number of days. And since, besides this, Eulalie knew, as no one else knew, how to distract my aunt without tiring her, her visits, which took place regularly every Sunday, unless something unforeseen occurred to prevent them, were for my aunt a pleasure the prospect of which kept her on those days in a state of expectation, appetizing enough to begin with, but at once changing to the agony of a hunger too long unsatisfied if Eulalie were a minute late in coming. For if unduly prolonged, the rapture of waiting for Eulalie became a torture, and my aunt would never cease from looking at the time and yawning, and complaining of each of her symptoms in turn. Eulalie's ring, if it sounded from the front door at the very end of the day, when she was no longer expecting it, would almost make her ill. For the fact was that on Sundays she thought of nothing else than this visit, and the moment that our luncheon was ended, Françoise would become impatient for us to leave the dining-room so that she might go upstairs to occupy my aunt. But, and this more than ever from the day on which fine weather definitely set in at Combray, the proud hour of noon, descending from the steeple of Saint-Hilaire, which it blazoned for a moment with the 12 points of its sonorous crown, would long have echoed about our table, beside the holy bread which too had come in after church in its familiar way, and we would still be found seated in front of our Arabian Nights plates, weighed down by the heat of the day and even more by our heavy meal. For upon the permanent foundation of eggs, cutlets, potatoes, preserves, and biscuits, whose appearance on the table she no longer announced to us, Françoise would add, as the labor of fields and orchards, the harvest of the tides, the luck of the markets, the kindness of neighbors, and her own genius might provide, and so effectively that our bill of fare, like the quatrefoils that were carved on the porches of cathedrals on the 13th century, reflected to some extent the march of the seasons and the incidents of human life. A brill, because the fishwoman had guaranteed its freshness; a turkey, because she had seen a beauty in the market at Roussenville-les-Pins; cardoons with marrow, because she had never done them for us in that way before; a roast leg of mutton, because the fresh air made one hungry, and there would be plenty of time for it to settle down in the 7 hours before dinner; spinach, by way of a change; apricots, because they were still hard to get; gooseberries, because in another fortnight there would be none left; raspberries, which Monsieur Swann had brought specially; cherries, the first to come from the cherry tree, which had yielded none for the last 2 years; a cream cheese, of which in those days I was extremely fond; an almond cake, because she had ordered one from the evening before; a fancy loaf, because it was our turn to offer the holy bread; and when all these had been eaten, a work composed expressly for ourselves, but dedicated more in particular to my father, who had a fondness for such things, a cream of chocolate, inspired in the mind, created by the hand of Francoise, would be laid before us, light and fleeting as an occasional piece of music, into which she had poured the whole of her talent. Anyone who refused to partake of it, saying, "No, thank you, I have finished, I am not hungry," would at once have been lowered to the level of the Philistines, who, when an artist makes them a present of one of his works, examine its weight and material, whereas what is of value is the creator's intention and his signature. To have left even the tiniest morsel in the dish would have been shown as much discourtesy as to rise and leave a concert hall while the piece was still being played, and under the composer's very eyes. At length my mother would say to me, "Now, don't stay here all day. You can go up to your room if you are too hot outside, but get a little fresh air first. Don't start reading immediately after your food." And I would go and sit down beside the pump in its trough, ornamented here and there like a Gothic font, with a salamander which modeled upon a background of crumbling stone the quick relief of its slender allegorical body, on the bench without a back, in the shade of a lilac tree, in that little corner of the garden which communicated by a service door with the Rue des Saint-Esprit, and from whose neglected soil rose in 2 stages an outcrop from the house itself, and apparently a separate building, my aunt's back kitchen. One could see its red-tiled floor gleaming like porphyry. It seemed not so much the cave of Francoise as a little temple of Venus. It would be overflowing with the offerings of the milkman, the fruiterer, the greengrocer, come sometimes from distant villages to dedicate here the first fruits of their fields, and its roof was always surmounted by the cooing of a dove. In earlier days I would have not lingered in the sacred grove which surrounded this temple, for being going upstairs to read, I would steal into the little sitting room which my uncle Adolphe, a brother of my grandfather and an old soldier who had retired from the service as a major, used to occupy on the ground floor, a room which, even when its opened windows let in the heat, if not actually the rays of the sun, which seldom penetrated so far, would never fail to emit that vague and yet fresh odor suggesting at once an open air and an old-fashioned kind of existence, which sets and keeps the nostrils dreaming when one goes into a disused gun-room. But for some years now I had not gone into my Uncle Adolphe's room, since he no longer came to Combray on account of a quarrel which had arisen between him and my family, by my fault, and in the following circumstances. Once or twice every month, in Paris, I used to be sent to pay him a visit, as he was finishing his luncheon, wearing a plain alpaca coat, and waited upon by his servant in a working jacket of striped linen, purple and white. He would complain that I had not been to see him for a long time, that he was being neglected. He would offer me a marchepane or tangerine, and we would cross a room in which no one ever sat, whose fire was never lighted, whose walls were picked out with gilded moldings, its ceiling painted blue in imitation of the sky, and its furniture upholstered in satin, as at my grandparents', only yellow. Then we would enter what he called his study room, whose walls were hung with prints, which showed against a dark background a plump and rosy goddess driving a car, or standing upon a globe, or wearing a star on her brow, pictures which were popular under the Second Empire, because there was thought to be something about them that suggested Pompeii, which were then generally despised, and which now people are beginning to collect again for one single and consistent reason, despite any others which they may advance, namely, that they suggest the Second Empire. And there would I stay with my uncle until his man came with a message from the coachman to ask him at what time he would like the carriage. My uncle would then be lost in meditation, while his astonished servant stood there, not daring to disturb him by the least movement, wondering and waiting for his answer, which never varied. For in the end, after a supreme crisis of hesitation, my uncle would utter infallibly the words, "A 2:15," which the servant would echo with amazement, but without disputing them. "A 2:15? Very good, sir. I will go and tell him." On which those words stood out. Nothing, unless it were such strange titles as the Testament de César Giraudoux or Oedipe Roy, inscribed not on the green bills of the Opera Comique, but on the wine-colored bills of the Comédie Française. At this date I was a lover of the theatre, a platonic lover of necessity, since my parents had not yet allowed me to enter one, and so incorrect was the picture I drew for myself of the pleasures to be enjoyed there, that I almost believed that each of the spectators looked, as into a stereoscope, upon a stage and scenery which existed for himself alone, though closely resembling the thousand other spectacles presented to the rest of the audience individually. Every morning I would hasten to the Morris column to see what new plays it announced. Nothing could be more disinterested or happier than the dreams with which these announcements filled my mind, dreams which took their form from the inevitable associations of the words forming the title of the play, and also from the color of the bills, still damp and wrinkled with paste, on which those words stood out. Nothing unless it were such strange titles as Cæsar Girardot's Testament, or Oedipus Rex, inscribed not on the green bills of the Opera Comique, but on the wine-colored bills of the Comédie Française. Nothing seemed to me to differ more profoundly from the sparkling white plume of the crowned diamonds than the sleek, mysterious satin of the black domino. And since my parents had told me that for my first visit to the theatre I should have chosen between these two pieces, I would study exhaustively and in turn the title of one and the title of the other, for those were all that I knew of either, attempting to snatch from each a foretaste of the pleasure which it offered me, and to compare this pleasure with that latent in the other title, until in the end I had shown myself such vivid, such compelling pictures of, on the one hand, a play of dazzling arrogance, and on the other a gentle, velvety play, that I was a little capable of deciding which play I should prefer to see, as if at the dinner table they had obliged me to choose between Rice to the Empress and the famous cream of chocolate. All my conversations with my playfellows bore upon actors, whose art, although as yet I had no experience of it, was the first of all its numberless forms in which art itself allowed me to anticipate its enjoyment. Between one actor's tricks of intonation and inflection and another's, the most trifling differences would strike me as being of incalculable importance. And from what I had been told of them, I would arrange them in the order of their talent in lists which I used to murmur to myself all day long, lists which in the end became petrified in my brain and were a source of annoyance to it, being irremovable. And later in my school days, whenever I ventured in class, When the master's head was turned to communicate with some new friend, I would always begin by asking him whether he had begun yet to go to theaters, and if he agreed that our greatest actor was undoubtedly Got, or second Delaunay, and so on. And if, in his judgment, Febre came below Thiron, or Delaunay between Coquelin, the sudden volatility which the name of Coquelin, forsaking its stony rigidity, would engender in my mind, in which it moved upwards to the second place, the rich vitality with which the name of Delaunay would suddenly be furnished, to enable it to slip down to fourth, would stimulate and fertilize my brain with a sense of bradding and blossoming life. That if thought of actors weighed so upon me, if the sight of Mordaunt coming out one afternoon from the Théâtre Français had plunged me in the throes and sufferings of hopeless love, how much more did the name of a star, blazing outside the doors of a theatre, how much more, seen through the window of a brougham which passed me in the street, the hair over her head abloom with roses, did the face of a woman, who I would think was perhaps an actress, leave with me a lasting disturbance, a futile and painful effort to form a picture of her private life. I classified in order of talent the most distinguished: Sarah Bernhardt, Burma Barthé, Madeleine Brohan, Jean Samaret, but I was interested in them all. Now my uncle knew many of them personally, and also ladies of another class, not clearly distinguished from actresses in my mind. He used to entertain them at his house, and if we went to see him on certain days only, that was because on the other days ladies might come who his family could not very well have met. So we at least thought. As for my uncle, his fatal readiness to pay pretty widows, who had perhaps never been married, and countesses, whose high-sounding titles were probably no more than noms de guerre, the compliment of presenting them to my grandmother, or even of presenting them to some of our family jewels, had already embroiled him more than once with my grandfather. Often, if the name of some actress were mentioned in conversation, I would hear my father say with a smile to my mother, "One of your uncle's friends," and I would think of the weary novitiate through which, perhaps years on end, a grown man, even a man of real importance, might have to pass, waiting on the doorstep of some such lady, while she refused to answer his letters, and made her hall porter drive him away, and imagine that my uncle was able to dispense a little jackanapes like myself from all these sufferings by introducing me in his own home to the actress, unapproachable by all the world, but for him an intimate friend. And so, on the pretext that some lesson, the hour of which had been altered, now came at such an awkward time that it had already more than once prevented me, and would continue to prevent me from seeing my uncle, one day, not one of the days which he set apart for our visits, I took advantage of the fact that my parents had had luncheon earlier than usual. I slipped out, and instead of going to read the playbills on their column, for which purpose I was allowed to go out unaccompanied, I ran all the way to his house. I noticed before his door a carriage and pair, with red carnations on the horse's blinkers and in the coachman's buttonhole. As I climbed the staircase, I could hear laughter and a woman's voice, and as soon as I had rung, silence and the sound of shutting doors. The manservant who let me in appeared embarrassed, and said that my uncle was extremely busy and probably could not see me. He went in, however, to announce my arrival, and the same voice I had heard before said, "Oh yes, do let him come in, just for a moment. It will be so amusing. Is that his photograph there on your desk? And his mother, your niece, isn't she, beside it? The image of her, isn't he? I should so like to see the little chap just for a second." I could hear my uncle grumbling and growing angry. Finally, the manservant told me to come in. On the table was the same plate of marchpans that was always there. My uncle wore the same alpaca coat as on other days, but opposite to him, in a pink silk dress with a great necklace of pearls about her throat, sat a young woman who was just finishing a tangerine. My uncertainty whether I ought to address her as Madame or Mademoiselle made me blush, and not daring to look too much in her direction, in case I should be obliged to speak to her, I hurried across to kiss my uncle. She looked at me and smiled. My uncle said, "My nephew," without telling her my name or telling me hers, doubtless because, since his difficulties with my grandfather, he had endeavored as far as possible to avoid any association of his family with this other class of acquaintance. "How like his mother he is," said the lady. "But you have never seen my niece except in photographs," my uncle broke in quickly with a note of anger. "I beg your pardon, dear friend. I passed her on the staircase last year when you were so ill. It is true I only saw her for a moment, and your staircase is rather dark, but I saw well enough to see how lovely she was. This young gentleman has her beautiful eyes, and also this," she went on, tracing a line with one finger across the lower part of her forehead. "Tell me," she asked my uncle, "is your niece, madame, is her name the same as yours?" "He takes most after his father," muttered my uncle, who was no more anxious to effect an introduction by proxy, in repeating mamma's name aloud than to bring the two together in the flesh. "He is his father all over, and also like my poor mother." "I have not met his father, dear," said the lady in pink, bowing her head slightly, "and I never saw your poor mother. You will remember it was just after your great sorrow that we got to know one another." I felt somewhat disillusioned, for this young lady was in no way different from other pretty women whom I had seen from time to time at home, especially the daughter of one of our cousins, to whose house I went every New Year's Day. Only better dressed. Otherwise, my uncle's friend had the same quick and kindly glance, the same frank and friendly manner. I could find no trace of her in the theatrical appearance which I admired in photographs of actresses, nothing of the diabolical expression which would have been keeping with the life she must lead. I had difficulty in believing that this was one of those women, and certainly I should never have believed her one of the smart ones had I not seen the carriage and pair, the pink dress, the pearly necklace, had I not been aware, too, that my uncle knew only the very best of them. But I asked myself how the millionaire who gave her her carriage and her flat and her jewels could find any pleasure in flinging his money away upon a woman who had so simple and respectable an appearance. And yet when I thought of what her life must be like, its immorality disturbed me more, perhaps than if it had stood before me in some concrete and recognizable form, by its secrecy and invisibility, like the plot of a novel, the hidden truth of a scandal which had driven out the home of her middle-class parents and dedicated to the service of all mankind, which had brought to the flowering point of her beauty, had raised to fame or notoriety this woman, the play of whose features, the intonations of whose voice, like so many others I already knew, made me regard her, in spite of myself, as a young lady of good family, her who was no longer of a family at all. We had gone by this time into the study, and my uncle, who seemed a trifle embarrassed by my presence, offered her a cigarette. "No, thank you, dear friend," she said. "You know I only smoke the ones the Grand Duke sends me. I tell him that they make you jealous." And she drew from her case a cigarette covered with inscriptions in gold, in a foreign language. "Why, yes," she began again suddenly, "of course I have met this young man's father with you. Isn't he your nephew? How on earth could I have forgotten? He was so nice, so charming to me." She went on modestly and with feeling. But when I thought to myself what must actually have been the rude greeting, which she made out had been so charming, I, who knew my father's coldness and reserve, was shocked, as though at some indelicacy on his part, at the contrast between the excessive recognition bestowed on it and his never adequate geniality. It has since struck me as one of the most touching aspects of the part played in life by these idle, painstaking women, that they devote all their generosity, all their talent, their transferable dreams of sentimental beauty, for like all other artists, they never seek to realize the value of those dreams, or to enclose them in the four-square frame of everyday life, and their gold, which counts for little, to the fashioning of a fine and precious setting for the rubbed and scratched and ill-polished lives of men. And just as this once filled the smoking room where my uncle was entertaining her in this alpaca coat, with her charming person, her dress of pink silk, her pearls, and the refinement suggested by intimacy with a Grand Duke, so in the same way she had taken some casual remark by my father, had worked it up delicately, given it a turn, a precious title, set it in the gem of a glance from her own eyes, a gem of the first water, blended of humility and gratitude, and so had given it back transformed into a jewel, a work of art, into something altogether charming. "Look here, my boy, it is time you went away," said my uncle. I rose. I could scarcely resist a desire to kiss the hand of the lady in pink, but I felt that to do so would require as much audacity as a forcible abduction of her. My heart beat loud while I counted out to myself, "Shall I do it? Shall I not?" And then I ceased to ask myself what I ought to do, so as at least to do something. Blindly, hotly, madly flinging aside all the reasons I had just found to support such action, I seized and raised to my lips the hand she held out to me. "Isn't he delicious? Quite a ladies' man already. He takes after his uncle. He'll be a perfect gentleman," she went on, setting her teeth so as to give the word a kind of English accentuation. "Couldn't he come to me some day for a cup of tea? As our friends across the channel say, he need only send me a blue in the morning." I had not the least idea of what a blue might be. I did not understand half the words which the lady used, but my fear lest there should be concealed in them some question which it would be impolite in me not to answer kept me from withdrawing my close attention from them, and I was beginning to feel extremely tired. "No, no, it is impossible," said my uncle, shrugging his shoulders. "He is kept busy at home all day. He has plenty of work to do. He brings back all the prizes from his school," he added in a lower tone, so that I should not hear this falsehood and interrupt with a contradiction. "You can't tell. He may turn out a little Victor Hugo, a kind of volleyball, don't you know?" "Oh, I love artistic people," replied the lady in pink. "There is no one like them for understanding women. Them and really nice men like yourself. But please forgive my ignorance. What is volleyball? Is it those gilt books and the little glass case in your drawing room? You know you promised to lend them to me. I will take great care of them." My uncle, who hated lending people books, said nothing and ushered me out into the hall. Madly in love with the lady in pink, I covered my old uncle's tobacco-stained cheeks with passionate kisses, and while he, awkwardly enough, gave me to understand, without actually saying, that he would rather I did not tell my parents about this visit, I assured him with tears in my eyes that his kindness had made so strong an impression upon me that some day I would most certainly find a way of expressing my gratitude. So strong an impression had it made upon me that 2 hours later, after a string of mysterious utterances which did not strike me as giving my parents a sufficiently clear idea of the new importance with which I had been invested, I found it simpler to let them have a full account, omitting no detail, of the visit I had paid that afternoon. In doing this, I had no thought of causing my uncle any unpleasantness. How could I have thought such a thing, since I did not wish it? And I could not suppose that my parents would see any harm in a visit in which I myself saw none. Every day of our lives does not some friend or other ask us to make his apologies, without fail, to some woman to whom he has been prevented from writing, and do not we forget to do so, feeling that this woman cannot attach much importance to a silence which has none for ourselves? I imagined, like everyone else, that the brains of other people were lifeless and submissive receptacles, with no power of specific reaction to any stimulus which might be applied to them, and I had not the least doubt that when I deposited in the minds of my parents the news of the acquaintance I had made at my uncle's, I should at the same time transmit to them the kindly judgment I myself based on the introduction. Unfortunately, my parents had recourse to principles entirely different from those which I suggested they should adopt when they came to form their estimate of my uncle's conduct. My father and grandfather had words with him of a violent order, as I learned indirectly. A few days later, passing my uncle in the street as he drove by in an open carriage, I felt at once all the grief, the gratitude, the remorse which I should have liked to convey to him. Beside the immensity of these emotions, I considered that merely to raise my hat to him would be incongruous and petty, and might make him think that I regarded myself as bound to show him no more than the commonest form of courtesy. I decided to abstain from so inadequate a gesture, and turned my head away. My uncle thought that in doing so I was obeying my parents' orders. He never forgave them, and though he did not die until many years later, not one of us ever set eyes on him again. and so I no longer used to go into the little sitting room, now kept shut, of my Uncle Adolphe. Instead, after hanging about on the outskirts of the back kitchen until Francoise appeared on its threshold and announced, "I am going to let the kitchen maid serve the coffee and take up the hot water. It is time I went off to Madame Octave." I would then decide to go indoors and would go straight upstairs to my room to read. The kitchen maid was an abstract personality, a permanent institution to which an invariable set of attributes assured a sort of fixity and continuity in identity throughout the long series of transitory human shapes in which that personality was incarnate, for we never found the same girl there 2 years running. In the year in which we ate such quantities of asparagus, the kitchen maid whose duty it was to dress them was a poor, sickly creature, some way gone in pregnancy when we arrived at Combray for Easter, and it was indeed surprising that Francoise allowed her to run so many errands in the town and to do so much work in the house, for she was beginning to find a difficulty in bearing before her the mysterious casket, fuller and larger every day, whose splendid outline could be detected through the folds of her ample smocks. These last recalled the cloaks in which Giotto shrouds from the allegorical figures in his paintings, of which Monsieur Swann had given me photographs. He it was who pointed out the resemblance, and when he inquired after the kitchen maid, he would say, "Well, how goes it with Giotto's charity?" And indeed the poor girl, whose pregnancy had swelled and stoutened every part of her, even to her face, and the vertical squared outlines of her cheeks, did distinctly suggest those virgins, so strong and mannish as to seem matrons rather, in whom the virtues are personified in the Arena Chapel. And I could now see that those virtues and vices of Padua resembled her in another respect as well. For just as the figure of this girl had been enlarged by the additional symbol which she carried in her body without appearing to understand what it meant, without any rendering in her facial expression of all its beauty and spiritual significance, but carried as if it were an ordinary and rather heavy burden, so it is without any apparent suspicion of what she is about that the powerfully built housewife, who is portrayed in the arena beneath the label Caritas, and a reproduction of whose portrait hung upon the wall of my schoolroom at Combray, incarnates that virtue, for it seems impossible that any thought of charity can ever have found expression in her vulgar and energetic face. By a fine stroke of the painter's invention, she is tumbling all the treasures of the earth at her feet, but exactly as if she were treading grapes in a wine-press to extract their juice, or, still more, as if she had climbed on a heap of sacks to raise herself higher, and she is holding out her flaming heart to God, or shall we say, handing it to him, exactly as a cook might hand up a corkscrew through the skylight of her underground kitchen to someone who had called down to ask her for it from the ground level above. The Invidia, again, should have had some look on her face of envy. But in this fresco, too, the symbol occupies so large a place, and is represented with such realism, the serpent hissing between the lips of envy is so huge, and so completely fills her wide-open mouth, that the muscles of her face are strained and contorted, like a child's who is filling a balloon with his breath, and that envy, and we ourselves for that matter, when we look at her, since all her attention and ours are concentrated on the action of her lips, have no time almost to spare for envious thoughts. Despite all the admiration that Monsieur Swann might profess for these figures of Giotto, it was a long time before I could find any pleasure in seeing in our schoolroom, where the copies he had brought me were hung, that charity devoid of charity, that envy who looked like nothing so much as a plate in some medicinal book, illustrating the compression of the glottis or uvula by a tumor in the tongue, or by the introduction of the operator's instrument, a justice whose grayish and meanly regular features were the very same as those which adorn the faces of certain good and pious and slightly withered ladies of Combray whom I used to see at Mass, many of whom had long been enrolled in the reserve forces of injustice. But in later years I understood that the arresting strangeness, the special beauty of these frescoes lay in the great part played in each of them by its symbols, while the fact that these were depicted not as symbols, for the thought symbolized was nowhere expressed, but as real things actually felt or materially handled, added something more precise and more literal to their meaning, something more concrete and more striking to the lesson they imparted. And even in the case of the poor kitchen maid, was not our attention incessantly drawn to her belly by the load which filled it? And in the same way again, are not the thoughts of men and women in the agony of death often turned towards the practical, painful, obscure, internal, intestinal aspect, towards that seamy side of death, which is, as it happens, the side that death actually presents to them and forces them to feel, a side which far more closely resembles a crushing burden, a difficulty in breathing, a destroying thirst, than the abstract idea to which we are accustomed to give the name of death. There must have been a strong element of reality in those virtues and vices of Padua, since they appeared to me to be as much alive as the pregnant servant girl, while she herself appeared scarcely less allegorical than they. And quite possibly, this lack or seeming lack of participation by a person's soul in the significant marks of its own special virtue has, apart from its aesthetic meaning, a reality which, if not strictly psychological, may at least be called physiognomical. Later on, when in the course of my life I have had occasion to meet with, in convents for instance, literally saintly examples of practical charity, they have generally had the brisk, decided, undisturbed, and slightly brutal air of a busy surgeon, the face in which one can discern no commiseration, no tenderness at the sight of suffering humanity, and no fear of hurting it, the face devoid of gentleness or sympathy, the sublime face of true goodness. Then, while the kitchen maid, who all unawares made the superior qualities of Francoise shine with added luster, just as error, by force of contrast, enhances the triumph of truth, took in coffee, which, according to Mamma, was nothing more than hot water, and then carried up to our rooms, hot water which was barely tepid. I would be lying stretched out on my bed, a book in my hand, in my room which trembled with the effort to defend its frail, transparent coolness against the afternoon sun, behind its almost closed shutters, through which, however, a reflection of the sunlight had contrived to slip in its golden wings, remaining motionless between glass and woodwork in a corner, like a butterfly poised upon a flower. It was hardly light enough for me to read, and my feeling of the day's brightness and splendor was derived solely from the blows struck down below, in the Rue de la Cure by Camus, whom Francoise had assured me that my aunt was not resting, and that he might therefore make a noise upon some old packing cases from which nothing would really be sent flying but the dust, though the din of them, and the resonant atmosphere that accompanies hot weather, seemed to scatter broadcast a rain of blood-red stars. And from the flies who performed for my benefit in their small concert, as it might be the chamber music of summer, evoking a heat and light quite differently from an air of human music, which, if you happen to have heard it during a fine summer, will always bring that summer back to your mind. The flies' music is bound to the season by a closer, a more vital tie, born of sunny days, and not to be reborn but with them, containing something of their essential nature. It not merely calls up their image in our memory, but gives us a guarantee that they really do exist, that they are close around us, immediately accessible. This dim freshness of my room was to the broad daylight of the street what the shadow is to the sunbeam, that is to say, equally luminous, and presented to my imagination the entire panorama of summer, which my senses, if I had been out walking, could have tasted and enjoyed in fragments only, and so was quite in harmony with my state of repose, which, thanks to the adventure related in my books, which had just excited it, bore like a hand reposing motionless in a stream of running water the shock and animation of a torrent of activity and life. But my grandmother, even if the weather, after growing too hot, had broken and a storm or just a shower had burst over us, would come up and beg me to go outside, and as I did not wish to leave off my book, I would go on with it in the garden, under the chestnut tree, in a little sentry box of canvas and matting, in the farthest recess of which I used to sit, and feel that I was hidden from the eyes of anyone who might be coming to call upon the family. And then my thoughts, did not they form a similar sort of hiding-hole, in the depths of which I felt that I could bury myself and remain invisible, even when I was looking at what went on outside? When I saw any external object, my consciousness that I was seeing it would remain between me and it, enclosing it in a slender, incorporeal outline which prevented me from ever coming directly in contact with the material form. For it would volatilize itself in some way before I could touch it, just as an incandescent body which is moved towards something wet never actually touches moisture, since it is always preceded itself by a zone of evaporation. Upon the sort of screen, patterned with different states and impressions which my consciousness would quietly unfold while I was reading, and which ranged from the most deeply hidden aspirations of my heart to the wholly external view of the horizon spread out before my eyes at the foot of the garden, what was from the first and most permanent and most intimate part of me, the lever whose incessant movements controlled all the rest, was my belief in the philosophic richness and beauty of the book I was reading, and my desire to appropriate these to myself, whatever the book might be. For even if I had purchased it at Combray, having seen outside Bouranger's, whose grocery lay too far from our house for Francois to be able to deal there as she did with Camus, but who enjoyed better custom as a stationer and bookseller, even if I had seen it, tied with string to keep it in its place in the mosaic of monthly parts and pamphlets which adorned either side of his doorway, a doorway more mysterious, more teeming with suggestion than that of a cathedral, I should have noticed and bought it there, simply because I had recognized it as a book which had been well spoken of in my hearing by the schoolmaster or the school friend who, at that particular time, seemed to me to be entrusted with the secret of truth and beauty, things half felt by me, half incomprehensible, the full understanding of which was the vague but permanent object of my thoughts. Next to this central belief, which while I was reading would be constantly a motion from my inner self to the outer world towards the discovery of truth, came the emotions aroused in me by the action in which I would be taking part, for these afternoons were crammed with more dramatic and sensational events than occur often in a whole lifetime. These were the events which took place in the book I was reading. It is true that the people concerned in them were not what Francois would have called real people, but none of the feelings which the joys or misfortunes of a real person awaken in us can be awakened except through a mental picture of those joys or misfortunes, and the ingenuity of the first novelist lay in his understanding that, as the picture was the one essential element in the complicated structure of our emotions, so that simplification of it, which consisted in the suppression, pure and simple, of real people, would be a decided improvement. A real person, profoundly as we may sympathize with him, is in a great measure perceptible only through our senses. That is to say, he remains opaque, offers a dead weight which our sensibilities have not the strength to lift. If some misfortune come to him, it is only in one small section of the complete idea we have of him that we are capable of feeling any emotion. Indeed, it is only in one small section of the complete idea he has of himself that he is capable of feeling any emotion either. The novelist's happy discovery was to think of substituting for those opaque sections, impenetrable by the human spirit, their equivalent in immaterial sections, things, that is, which the spirit can assimilate to itself. After which it matters not that the actions, the feelings of this new order of creatures appear to us in the guise of truth, since we have made them our own, since it is in ourselves that they are happening, that they are holding in thrall while we turn over feverishly the pages of the book, our quickened breath and staring eyes. And once the novelist has brought us to that state, in which, as in all purely mental states, every emotion is multiplied tenfold, into which his book comes to disturb us as might a dream, but a dream more lucid and of a more lasting impression than those which come to us in sleep. Why, then, for the space of an hour, he sets free within us all the joys and sorrows in the world, a few of which only we should have to spend years of our actual life in getting to know, and the keenest, most intense of which would never have been revealed to us, because of the slow course of their development stops our perception of them. It is the same in life. The heart changes, and that is our worst misfortune, but we learn of it only by reading or by imagination. For in reality, its alteration, like that of certain natural phenomena, is so gradual that even if we are able to distinguish successively each of its different states, we are still spared the actual sensation of change. Next to, but distinctly less intimate, a part of myself than this human element, would come the view, more or less projected before my eyes, of the country in which the action of the story was taking place, which made a far stronger impression on my mind than the other, the actual landscape, which would meet my eyes when I raised them from my book. In this way, for 2 consecutive summers, I used to sit in the heat of our Combray garden, sick with a longing inspired by the book I was then reading for a land of mountains and rivers, where I could see an endless vista of sawmills, where beneath the limpid currents fragments of wood lay mouldering in beds of watercress, and nearby, rambling and clustering along low walls, purple flowers and red. And since there was always lurking in my mind the dream of a woman who would enrich me with her love, that dream in those 2 summers used to be quickened with the freshness and coolness of running water. And whoever she might be, the woman whose image I call to mind, purple flowers and red would at once spring up on either side of her like complementary colors. This was not only because an image of which we dream remains forever distinguished, is adorned and enriched by the association of colors not its own, which may happen to surround it in our mental picture, for the scenes in the books I read were to me not merely scenery more vividly portrayed by my imagination than any which Combray could spread before my eyes, but otherwise of the same kind. Because of the selection that the author had made of them, because of the spirit of faith in which my mind would exceed and anticipate his printed word, as it might be interpreting a revelation, these scenes used to give me the impression, one which I hardly ever derived from any place in which I might happen to be, and never from our garden, that undistinguished product of the strictly conventional fantasy of the gardener, whom my grandmother so despised, of their being actually part of nature herself, and worthy to be studied and explored. Had my parents allowed me, when I read a book, to pay a visit to the country it described, I should have felt that I was making an enormous advance towards the ultimate conquest of truth. For even if we have the sensation of being always enveloped and surrounded by our own soul, still it does not seem a fixed and immovable prison. Rather do we seem to be borne away with it, and perpetually struggling to pass beyond it, to break out into the world, with a perpetual discouragement as we hear endlessly all around us that unvarying sound which is no echo from without, but the resonance of a vibration from within. We try to discover in things endeared to us on that account the spiritual glamour which we ourselves have cast upon them. We are disillusioned, and learn that they are in themselves barren and devoid of the charm which they owed, in our minds, to the association of certain ideas. Sometimes we mobilize all our spiritual forces in a glittering array so as to influence and subjugate other human beings, who, as we very well know, are situated outside ourselves, where we can never reach them. And so, if I always imagined the woman I loved as in a setting of whatever places I most longed at the time to visit, if in my secret longings it was she who attracted me to them, who opened to me the gate of an unknown world, that was not by the mere hazard of a simple association of thoughts. No, it was because my dreams of travel and of love were only moments, which I isolate artificially today, as though I were cutting sections at different heights in a jet of water, rainbow flashing but seemingly without flow or motion, were only drops in a single, undeviating, irresistible outrush of all the forces of my life. And then, as I continue to trace the outward course of these impressions from their close-packed, intimate source in my consciousness, and before I come to the horizon of reality which envelops them, I discover pleasures of another kind, those of being comfortably seated, of tasting the good scent on the air, of not being disturbed by any visitor. And when an hour chimed from the steeple of Saint-Hilaire, of watching what was already spent of the afternoon fall drop by drop until I heard the last stroke which enabled me to add up the total sum, after which the silence that followed seemed to herald the beginning, and the blue sky above me of that long part of the day still allowed me for reading, until the good dinner which Françoise was even now preparing should come to strengthen and refresh me after the strenuous pursuit of its hero through the pages of my book. And as each hour struck, it would seem to me that a few seconds only had passed since the hour before. The latest would inscribe itself, close to its predecessor on the sky's surface, and I would be unable to believe that 60 minutes could be squeezed into the tiny arc of blue which was comprised between their two golden figures. Sometimes it would even happen that this precious hour would sound 2 strokes more than the last. There must have been an hour in which I had not heard strike. Something which had taken place had not taken place for me. The fascination of my book, a magic as potent as the deepest slumber, had stopped my enchanted ears and had obliterated the sound of that golden bell from the azure surface of the enveloping silence. Sweet Sunday afternoons beneath the chestnut tree in our Combray garden, from which I was careful to eliminate every commonplace incident of my actual life, replacing them by a career of strange adventures and ambitions in a land watered by living streams. You still recall those adventures and ambitions to my mind when I think of you, and embody and preserve them by virtue of having little by little drawn round and enclosed them, while I went on with my book, and the heat of the day declined, and the gradual crystallization, slowly altering in form and dappled with a pattern of chestnut leaves, of your silent, sonorous, fragrant, limpid hours. Sometimes I would be torn from my book in the middle of the afternoon by the gardener's daughter, who came running like a mad thing, overturning an orange tree in its tub, cutting a finger, breaking a tooth, and screaming out, "They're coming! They're coming!" so that Francoise and I should run too, and not miss anything of the show. That was on days when the cavalry stationed in Combray went out for some military exercise, going as a rule by Rue Saint-Hildegarde. While our servants, sitting in a row on their chairs outside the garden railings, stared at the people of Combray taking their Sunday walks and were stared at in return, the gardener's daughter, through the gap which there was between 2 houses far away in the Avenue de la Gare, would have spied the glitter of helmets. The servants then hurried in with their chairs, for when the troopers filed through the Rue Saint-Hildegarde, they filled it from side to side, and their jostling horses scraped against the walls of the houses, covering and drowning the pavement like banks which present too narrow a channel to a river in flood. "Poor children," Francoise would exclaim in tears almost before she had reached the railings. "Poor boys, to be mown down like grass in a meadow. It's just shocking to think of." She would go on laying a hand over her heart, where presumably she had felt the shock. "A fine sight, isn't it, Madame Francoise, all these young fellows not caring 2 straws for their lives?" the gardener would ask, just to draw her, and he would not have spoken in vain. "Not caring for their lives, is it? Why, what in the world is there that we should care for if it's not our lives? The only gift the Lord never offers us a second time. Oh dear, you're right all the same. It's quite true they don't care. I can remember them in '70. In those wretched wars they've no fear of death left in them. They're nothing more nor less than madmen. And then they aren't worth the price of a rope to hang them with. They're not men any more. They're lions." For by her way of thinking to compare a man with a lion, which she used to pronounce lion, was not at all complimentary to the man. The Rue Saint-Hildegarde turned too sharply for us to be able to see people approaching at any distance, and it was only through the gap between those 2 houses in the Avenue de la Gare that we could still make out fresh helmets racing along towards us and flashing in the sunlight. The gardener wanted to know whether there were still many to come, and he was thirsty besides, with the sun beating down upon his head. So then suddenly his daughter would leap out as though from a beleaguered city, would make a sortie, turn the street corner, and having risked her life 100 times over, reappear and bring us, with a jug of licorice water, the news that there were still at least 1,000 of them, pouring along without a break from the direction of Thiberzy and Méséglise. Francoise and the gardener, having made up their difference, would discuss the line to be followed in case of war. "Don't you see, Francoise," he would say, "revolution would be better, because then no one would need to join in unless he liked." "Oh yes, I can see that, certainly. It's more straightforward." The gardener believed that, as soon as war was declared, they would stop all the railways. "Yes, to be sure, so that we shan't get away," said Francoise. And the gardener would assent with, "They're cunning ones," for he would not allow that war was anything but a kind of trick which the state attempted to play on the people, or that there was a man in the world who would not run away from it if he had the chance to do so. But Francoise would hasten back to my aunt, and I would return to my book, and the servants would take their places again outside the gate to watch the dust settle on the pavement, and the excitement caused by the passage of the soldiers subside. Long after order had been restored, an abnormal tide of humanity would continue to darken the streets of Combray, and in front of every house, even those where it was not as a rule done, the servants and sometimes even the masters would sit and stare, festooning their doorsteps with a dark irregular fringe, like the border of shells and seaweed which a stronger tide than usual leaves on the beach, as though trimming it with embroidered crepe, when the sea itself has retreated. Except on such days as these, however, I would as a rule be left to read in peace. But the interruption which a visit from Swann once made, and the commentary which he then supplied to the course of my reading, which had brought me to the work of an author quite new to me called Bergotte, had this definite result that for a long time afterwards it was not against a wall gay with spikes of purple blossom, but on a wholly different background, the porch of a Gothic cathedral, that I would see outlying the figure of one of the women of whom I dreamed. I had heard Bergotte spoken of for the first time by a friend older than myself, for whom I had a strong admiration, a precious youth of the name of Bloch. Hearing me confess my love of the October night, he had burst out in a bray of laughter like a bugle call and told me by way of warning, "You must conquer your vile taste for Eau de Musette, Esquire. He is a bad egg, one of the very worst, a pretty detestable specimen. I am bound to admit, nonetheless," he added graciously, "that he, and even the man Racine, did each of them, once in his life, compose a line which is not only fairly rhythmical, but has also what is in my eyes the supreme merit of meaning absolutely nothing. One is White Aluson and White Chimera, and the other the daughter of Minos and Pasiphae. They were submitted to my judgment as evidence for the defense of the two runagates, in an article by my very dear master, Father Lecomte, who was found pleasing in the sight of the immortal gods. By which token, here is a book which I have not the time just now to read, a book recommended, it would seem, by that colossal fellow. He regards, or so they tell me, its author, one Bergotte, Esquire, as a subtle scribe, more subtle indeed than any beast of the field, and albeit he exhibits on occasion a critical pacifism, a tenderness in suffering fools, for which it is impossible to account and hard to make allowance, still his word has weight, and with me as it were the Delphic oracle. Read you then this lyrical prose, and if the titanic master builder of rhythm who composed Bhagavat and Magnus the Greyhound speaks not falsely, then by Apollo you may taste, even you, my master, the ambrosial joys of Olympus." It was in an ostensible vein of sarcasm that he had asked me to call him, and that he himself called me my master. But as a matter of fact, we each derived a certain amount of satisfaction from the mannerism, being still at the age in which one believes that one gives a thing real existence by giving it a name. Unfortunately, I was not able to set at rest by further talks with Bloch, in which I might have insisted upon an explanation, the doubts he had engendered in me when he told me that fine lines of poetry, from which I, if you please, expected nothing less than the revelation of truth itself, were all the finer if they meant absolutely nothing. For, as it happened, Bloch was not invited to the house again. At first, he had been well received there. It is true that my grandfather made out that, whenever I formed strong attachment to any one of my friends and brought him home with me, that friend was invariably a Jew, to which he would not have objected on principle. Indeed, his own friend, Swann, was of Jewish extraction, had he not found that Jews whom I chose as friends were not usually of the best type. And so I was hardly ever able to bring a new friend home without my grandfather's humming the "O God of our fathers" from La Juve, or else "Israel break thy chain," singing the tune alone, of course, to an tum-ti-tum-ti-tum-ti-tra-la, but I used to be afraid of my friends recognizing the sound, and so being able to reconstruct the words. Before seeing them, merely on hearing their names, about which, as often as not, there was nothing particularly Hebraic, he would divine not only the Jewish origin of such of my friends as might indeed be of the chosen people, but even some dark secret which was hidden in their family. "And what do they call your friend who is coming this evening?" "Dumont, Grandpapa." "Dumont? Oh, I am frightened of Dumont." And he would sing, "Archers, be on your guard. Watch without rest, without sound." And then after a few adroit questions on points of detail, he would call out, "On guard, on guard." Or if it were the victim himself who had already arrived and had been obliged unconsciously by my grandfather's subtle examination to admit his origin, then my grandfather, to show us that he had no longer any doubts, would merely look at us, humming almost inaudibly the air of, "What do you hither guide the feet of this timid Israelite?" Or of "Sweet Vale of Hebron, dear paternal fields," or perhaps of "Yes, I am of the chosen race." These little eccentricities on my grandfather's part implied no ill will whatsoever towards my friends, but Bloch had displeased my family for other reasons. He had begun by annoying my father, who, in seeing him come in with wet clothes, had asked him with keen interest, "Why, Monsieur Bloch, is there a change in the weather? Has it been raining? I can't understand it. The barometer has been set fair." Which drew from Bloch nothing more instructive than, "Sir, I am absolutely incapable of telling you whether it has rained. I live so resolutely apart from physical contingencies that my senses no longer trouble to inform me of them." "My poor boy," said my father after Bloch had gone, "your friend is out of his mind. Why, he couldn't even tell me what the weather was like. As if there could be anything more interesting. He is an imbecile." Next, Bloch had displeased my grandmother, because after luncheon, when she complained of not feeling very well, he had stifled a sob and wiped the tears from his eyes. "You cannot imagine that he is sincere," she observed to me. "Why, he doesn't know me. Unless he's mad, of course." And finally he had upset the whole household when he arrived an hour and a half late for luncheon, and covered with mud from head to foot, and made not the least apology, saying merely, "I never allow myself to be influenced in the smallest degree, either by atmospheric disturbances or by the arbitrary divisions of what is known as time. I would willingly reintroduce to society the opium pipe of China or the Malayan kris, but I am wholly and entirely without instruction on those infinitely more pernicious, besides being quite bleakly bourgeois, implements, the umbrella and the watch." In spite of all this, he could have still been received at Combray. He was, of course, hardly the friend my parents would have chosen for me. They had in the end decided that the tears which he had shed on hearing of my grandmother's illness were genuine enough, that they knew either instinctively or from their own experience that our early impulsive emotions have but little influence over our later actions and the conduct of our lives, and that the regard for moral obligations, loyalty to our friends, patience in finishing our work, obedience to a rule of life, have a surer foundation in habits solidly formed and blindly followed than in these momentary transports, ardent but sterile. They would have preferred to Bloch as companions for myself boys who would have given me no more than it is proper, by all the laws of middle-class morality, for boys to give one another, who would not unexpectedly send me a basket of fruit because they happened that morning to have thought of me with affection, but who, since they were incapable of inclining in my favor by any single impulse of their imagination and emotions, the exact balance of the duties and claims of friendship, were as incapable of loading the scales to my prejudice. Even the injuries we do them will not easily divert from the path of their duty towards us those conventional natures of which my great-aunt furnished a type, who, after quarreling for years with a niece to whom she never spoke again, yet made no change in the will in which she had left that niece the whole of her fortune, because she was her next of kin, and it was the proper thing to do. But I was fond of Bloch. My parents wished me to be happy, and the insoluble problems which I set myself on such texts as the absolutely meaningless beauty of The Daughter of Minos and Pasiphae tired me more and made me more unwell than I should have been after further talks with him, unwholesome as those talks might seem to my mother's mind. And he would still have been received at Combray but for one thing. That same night, after dinner, having informed me, a piece of news which had a great influence on my later life, making it happier at one time and then more unhappy, that no woman ever thought of anything but love, and that there was not one of them whose resistance a man could not overcome, he had gone on to assure me that he had heard it said on unimpeachable authority that my great-aunt herself had led a gay life in her younger days, and had been notoriously kept. I could not refrain from passing on so important a piece of information to my parents. The next time Bloch called, he was not admitted, and afterwards, when I met him in the street, he greeted me with extreme coldness. But in the matter of Bergotte, he had spoken truly. For the first few days, like a tune which will be running in one's head and maddening one soon enough, but of which one has not for the moment got hold, the things I was to love so passionately in Bergotte's style had not yet caught my eye. I could not, it is true, lay down the novel of his which I was reading, but I fancied that I was interested in the story alone, as in the first dawn of love, when we go every day to meet a woman at some party or entertainment, by the charm of which we imagine it is that we are attracted. Then I observed the rare, almost archaic phrases which he liked to employ at certain points where a hidden flow of harmony, a prelude contained and concealed in the work itself, would animate and elevate his style. And it was at such points as these, too, that he would begin to speak of the vain dream of life, of the inexhaustible torrent of fair forms, of the sterile, splendid torture of understanding and loving, of the moving effigies which ennoble for all time the charming and venerable fronts of our cathedrals, that he would express a whole system of philosophy, new to me, by the use of marvelous imagery, to the inspiration of which I would naturally have ascribed that sound of harping which began to chime and echo in my ears, an accompaniment to which that imagery added something ethereal and sublime. One of these passages of Bergotte, the third or fourth which I had detached from the rest, filled me with a joy to which the meager joy I had tasted in the first passage bore no comparison, a joy which I felt myself to experience in some innermost chamber of my soul, deep, undivided, vast, from which all obstructions and partitions seemed to have been swept away. For what had happened was that, while I recognized in this passage the same taste for uncommon phrases, the same bursts of music, the same idealist philosophy which had been present in the earlier passages without my having taken them into account as the source of my pleasure, I now no longer had the impression of being confronted by a particular passage in one of Bergotte's works, which traced a purely bi-dimensional figure in outline upon the surface of my mind, but rather of the ideal passage of Bergotte, common to every one of his books, and to which all the earlier, similar passages now becoming merged in it had added a kind of density and volume, by which my own understanding seemed to be enlarged. I was by no means Bergotte's sole admirer. He was the favorite writer also of a friend of my mother's, a highly literary lady, while Dr. du Boulbon had kept all his patients waiting until he finished Bergotte's latest volume, and it was from his consulting room and from a house in a park near Combray that some of the first seeds were scattered of that taste for Bergotte, a rare growth in those days, but now so universally acclimatized that one finds it flowering everywhere throughout Europe and America, and even in the tiniest villages, rare still in its refinement, but in that alone. What my mother's friend, and it would seem what Dr. du Boulbon liked above all in the writings of Bergotte, was just what I liked, the same flow of melody, the same old-fashioned phrases, and certain others, quite simple and familiar, but so placed by him in such prominence as to hint at a particularly quality of taste on his part, and also in the sad parts of his book, a sort of roughness, a tone that was almost harsh. And he himself no doubt realized that these were his principal attractions. For in his later books, if he had hit upon some great truth, or upon the name of a historic cathedral, he would break off his narrative, and in an invocation, an apostrophe, a lengthy prayer, would give a free outlet to that effluence, which in the earlier volumes remained buried beneath the form of his prose, discernible only in a rippling of its surface, and perhaps even more delightful, more harmonious than it was thus, veiled from the eye, when the reader could give no precise indication of where the murmur of the current began or where it died away. These passages in which he delighted were our favorites also. For my own part, I knew all of them by heart. I felt even disappointed when he resumed the thread of his narrative. Whenever he spoke of something whose beauty had until then remained hidden from me, of pine forests or of hailstorms, of Notre Dame de Paris or of Atali or Phèdre, by some piece of imagery he would make their beauty explode and drench me with its essence. And so, dimly realizing that the universe contained innumerable elements which my feeble senses would be powerless to discern, did he not bring them within my reach? I wished that I might have his opinion, some metaphor of his, upon everything in the world, and especially upon such things as I might have an opportunity some day of seeing for myself, and among such things, more particularly still upon some of the historic buildings of France, upon certain views of the sea, because the emphasis with which in his books he referred to these showed that he regarded them as rich in significance and beauty. But, alas, upon almost everything in the world his opinion was unknown to me. I had no doubt that it would differ entirely from my own, since his came down from an unknown sphere towards which I was striving to raise myself. Convinced that my thoughts would have seemed pure foolishness to that perfected spirit, I had so completely obliterated them all that, if I happened to find in one of his books something which had already occurred to my own mind, my heart would swell with gratitude and pride, as though some deity had, in his infinite bounty, restored it to me, had pronounced it to be beautiful and right. It happened now and then that a page of Bergotte would express precisely those ideas which I used often at night, when I was unable to sleep, to write to my grandmother and mother, and so concisely and so well that his page had the appearance of a collection of mottos for me to set at the head of my letters. And so too in later years, when I began to compose a book of my own, and the quality of some of my sentences seemed so inadequate that I could not make up my mind to go on with the undertaking, I would find the equivalent of my sentences in Bergotte's. But it was only then, when I read them in his pages, that I could enjoy them. When it was I myself who composed them, in my anxiety that they should exactly reproduce what I seemed to have detected in my mind, and in my fear of their not turning out true to life, I had no time to ask myself whether what I was writing would be pleasant to read. But indeed there was no kind of language, no kind of ideas which I really liked, except these. My feverish and unsatisfactory attempts were themselves a token of my love, a love which brought me no pleasure, but was for all that intense and deep. And so, when I came suddenly upon similar phrases in the writings of another, that is to say, stripped of their familiar accompaniment of scruples and repressions and self-tormentings, I was free to indulge to the full of my own appetite for such things, just as a cook who, once in a while, has no dinner to prepare for other people, can then find time to gourmandize himself. And so, when I had found one day in a book by Bergotte some joke about an old family servant, to which his solemn and magnificent style added a great deal of irony, but which was in principle what I had often said to my grandmother about Françoise, and when another time I had discovered that he thought not unworthy of reflection in one of those mirrors of absolute truth which were his writings, a remark similar to one which I had occasion to make on our friend Monsieur Legrandin, and moreover my remarks on Françoise and Monsieur Legrandin were among those which I would most resolutely have sacrificed for Bergotte's sake, in the belief that he would find them quite without interest, then it was suddenly revealed to me that my own humble existence and the realms of truth were less widely separated than I had supposed, that at certain points they were actually in contact, and in my new-found confidence and joy I wept upon his printed page as in the arms of a long-lost father. From his books I had formed the impression of Bergotte as a frail and disappointed old man who had lost his children and had never found any consolation. And so I would read, or rather sing his sentences in my brain with rather more dolce, rather more lento, than he himself had perhaps intended, and his simplest phrase would strike my ears with something peculiarly gentle and loving in its intonation. More than anything else in the world, I cherished his philosophy, and had pledged myself to it in lifelong devotion. It made me impatient to reach the age when I should be eligible to attend the class at school called philosophy. I did not wish to learn or do anything else there, but simply to exist and be guided entirely by the mind of Bergot. And if I had been told then that the metaphysicians whom I was actually to follow there resembled him in nothing, I should have been struck down by the despair a young lover feels who has sworn lifelong fidelity when a friend speaks to him of the other mistresses he will have in time to come. One Sunday, while I was reading in the garden, I was interrupted by Swann, who had come to call upon my parents. "What are you reading? May I look?" "Why, it's Bergot. Who has been telling you about him?" I replied that Bloch was responsible. "Oh yes, that boy I saw here once, who looks so like that Bellini portrait of Mohammed II. It's an astonishing likeness. He has the same arched eyebrows and hooked nose and prominent cheekbones. When his beard comes, he'll be Mohammed himself. Anyhow, he has good taste, for Bergot is a charming creature." And seeing how much I seemed to admire Bergot, Swann, who never spoke at all about the people he knew, made an exception in my favor and said, "I know him well. If you would like him to write a few words on the title page of your book, I could ask him for you." I dared not accept such an offer, but bombarded Swann with questions about his friend. "Can you tell me, please, who is his favorite actor?" "Actor? No, I can't say, but I do know this. There's not a man on the stage whom he thinks equal to Burma. He puts her above everyone. Have you seen her?" "No, sir, my parents do not allow me to go to the theater." "That is a pity. You should insist. Burma in Phaedra, in the Cid, well, she's only an actress, if you like, but you know that I don't believe very much in the hierarchy of the arts." As he spoke, I noticed what had often struck me before in his conversations with my grandmother's sisters, that whenever he spoke of serious matters, whenever he used an expression which seemed to imply a definite opinion upon some important subject, he would take care to isolate, to sterilize it by using a special intonation, mechanical and ironic, as though he had put the phrase or word between inverted commas, and was anxious to disclaim any personal responsibility for it. As who should say, "The hierarchy. Don't you know, as silly people call it?" But then if it was so absurd, why did he say the hierarchy? A moment later he went on, "Her acting will give you as noble an inspiration as any masterpiece of art in the world. I don't know," and he began to laugh, "shall we say the Queen of Chartres?" Until then I had supposed that his horror of having to give a serious opinion was something Parisian and refined, in contrast to the provincial dogmatism of my grandmother's sisters. And I had imagined also that it was characteristic of the mental attitude towards life of the circle in which Swann moved, where by a natural reaction from the lyrical enthusiasms of earlier generations, an excessive importance was given to small and precise facts, formerly regarded as vulgar, and anything in the nature of phrase-making was banned. But now I found myself slightly shocked by this attitude which Swann invariably adopted when face to face with generalities. He appeared unwilling to risk even having an opinion, and to be at his ease only when he could furnish, with meticulous accuracy, some precise but unimportant detail. But in so doing, he did not take into account that even here he was giving an opinion, holding a brief, as they say, for something, that the accuracy of his details had an importance of its own. I thought again of the dinner that night, when I had been so unhappy because Mamma would not be coming up to my room, and when he had dismissed the balls given by Princess de Leon as being of no importance. And yet it was just that sort of amusement that he was devoting his life. For what other kind of existence did he reserve the duties of saying in all seriousness what he thought about things, of formulating judgments which he would not put between inverted commas, and when he would cease to give himself up to occupations of which at the same time he made out that they were absurd? I noticed too in the manner in which Swann spoke to me of Bergot something which, to do him justice, was not peculiar to himself, but was shared by all that writer's admirers at the time, at least by my mother's friend and by Dr. du Balbon. Like Swann, they would say of Bergot, "He has a charming mind, so individual. He has a way of his own of saying things, which is a little far-fetched, but so pleasant. You never need to look for his name on the title page. You can tell his work at once. but none of them had yet gone so far as to say, "He is a great writer. He has great talent." They did not even credit him with talent at all. They did not speak because they were not aware of it. We are very slow in recognizing in the peculiar physiognomy of a new writer the type which is labeled great talent in our Museum of General Ideas. Simply because that physiognomy is new and strange, we can find in it no resemblance to what we are accustomed to call talent. We say rather originality, charm, delicacy, strength, and then one day we add up the sum of these and find that it amounts simply to talent. "Are there any books in which Bergotte has written about Burma?" I asked Monsieur Swann. "I think he has, in that little essay on Racine, but it must be out of print. Still, there has perhaps been a second impression. I will find out. Anyhow, I can ask Bergotte himself all that you want to know next time he comes to dine with us. He never misses a week, from one year's end to another. He is my daughter's greatest friend. They go about together and look at old towns and cathedrals and castles."